Hey folks, today I've got a really exciting mod to share, or at least exciting to me. It's something that I've been wanting to do for a while now, but I knew it would take a lot of trial and error, and so I just had to find the time to set aside to complete it. And I finally did, and man, am I glad that I did, because it solves two problems for RVers. And I'll give you a hint, it has something to do with this random unlabeled switch right here above my BM Pro panel and next to the solar charge controller. You can see that when I flip the switch on, this light here, it turns blue, signaling that the switch is on. But what does this switch specifically do? Well, I'm glad you asked, because this switch right here, it turns on the power to my entire Furrion camera system, you know, with the rear observation camera in the back and then the two side cameras toward the front. So what's the big deal about that, right? Well, if you're a Jayco owner like myself, and really the vast majority of RV brands out there, they do this. But you know that the Furrion observation cameras and the side cameras, typically the RV manufacturers wire them into your running lights or your clearance lights so that they get power through the 7-way connector anytime you turn on your running lights or parking lights on the tow vehicle on your truck. And it's pretty clever, as you know, the cameras are all pretty close to the clearance lights on the RV already, and so it's an easy source of power to tap into. But your running lights have to be turned on in order for the cameras to work. So that means if you want to use your cameras while you're driving, and you know, I primarily use the rear one for peace of mind during lane changes, really just to keep a safe distance between the car or truck behind my RV. But as I was saying, if you want to use the cameras while you're driving, then of course you've got to have your clearance lights on both the RV and your tow vehicle, and that's 100% of the time, even in the daytime when normally, you know, your clearance lights wouldn't be necessary. In fact, if the sun is out, I don't think you're even going to be able to tell that your clearance lights are on in the first place. But they have to be on in order to supply power to all the Furrion cameras. Now, this isn't a huge deal necessarily, as what's the harm done in keeping your running lights on 100% of the time, right? I mean, most modern RVs, they have LED lights, so they should last a pretty long time. But you know, it's always kind of bugged me that I've got to keep my running lights on 100% of the time while I'm driving, just so I can make use of the cameras on the RV. I mean, the RVs, most of them are going to have LED lights, but that's still a dozen or more lights that are running unnecessarily. It's extra energy, it's taking away from the LED lifespan, and again, all just so I can use the cameras. So I've always wanted to solve the problem of powering my cameras via another power source, so I don't have to use my running lights and have them on 100% of the time in order to use the cameras. And I'll just mention that not all RV brands do this. I had a 2016 Grand Design Reflection years ago, and that one powered the backup camera directly off of the 12-volt system. So basically, anytime the battery disconnect was not engaged, then the Furrion backup camera was hot. But out of the 5 RVs that I've owned, that was the only brand that did it like that. So all the other ones were wired into the clearance lights. And like I said on the Reflection, the rear camera was always hot. So there was no way to turn it off unless I, enabled the battery disconnect. And I almost like that option better than forcing my running lights to be on 100% of the time, but I still would prefer a means to control manually and turn off the cameras and then choose when I want to be able to use them and turn them on. So in today's video, I'm going to share how to solve that problem, how to be able to choose when your cameras are on and when your cameras are off. And as a bonus, the other big problem that gets solved here in the process is that now you can use your rear observation camera, and even more importantly, your side marker cameras, as a, get this, a security system of sorts. Having surveillance cameras essentially on your RV to monitor your surroundings while at your campsite and unhitched from your tow vehicle. Now you can do this by taking the monitor that's normally in your truck, the display, right, and then bring it into your RV, almost like a security camera monitor. And this is kind of a high-end feature that a lot of fancy Class A coaches have. In fact, they probably have more than just 3 camera angles. They probably have half a dozen or more. But imagine being able to use the existing cameras on your RV kind of in a multi-purpose fashion and then see around your campsite. And you probably know this, but the Furrion cameras, they actually have night vision, illuminating things at night. And so it just gives you a leg up on safety to be able to see, what's around your campsite, even at nighttime. But there's always a but, right? But solving those problems are easier said than done, as you have to run a separate 12-volt positive wire to all of your cameras. And we're talking about the full length of your RV essentially. Most folks are probably going to have a rear camera in the back and then possibly 2 side cameras toward the front. And I mean, I'm talking about a finished RV that doesn't have typically great access to the ceiling and the roof or other little nooks and crannies. And so you got to figure out how to fish all those wires to all your camera locations. And depending on your RV floor plan, that may be quite challenging or even, next to impossible without dismantling it in some way. Now, some of you might be thinking, why not just put a jumper on your 7-way connector, what plugs into your tow vehicle, to run power to the clearance lights, and then the problem is solved in a matter of seconds with no significant effort, right? Well, have you ever stayed at a campground and you've seen another RV, perhaps a neighbor, and they've kept all of their running lights on, their clearance lights on 100% of the time while they were at the campsite? Well, that's precisely what they're doing. They're sending power to their clearance lights by jumping that 7-way connector. And typically they're doing it to use their cameras at the same time. And yes, this does work. But do you really want to keep your clearance lights on the entire time while you're stationary at your campsite? I mean, all night long, all day long. And no offense again to those that do that. Certainly it's your preference, your choice. But that's just not a very elegant solution in my opinion. I really want to operate my Furrion camera separate from the clearance lights by having its own separate switch. And I've got some good news and some bad news on this. So we'll do the bad news first. The bad news is that this mod is fairly intense. There's a lot of details. I'm going to try to articulate everything clearly so that you can do it on yours. But the good news is, and this is especially if you've got a Jayco, is that they actually pre-wire the option to run your rear camera off of a separate power source. In fact, I think they do this in just about all their towables. So essentially, Jayco runs an extra wire between the rear backup camera and then a central source. It's going to be typically either where your control panel is, the BM Pro panel, or near a bedroom light switch. Just kind of depends on the model year and your floor plan. And get this, not only does Jayco run a separate wire to the camera, a spare one, but in my case here on the Pinnacle 37 MDQS, they actually also supplied a 12-volt positive wire in that same termination point. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So here in my 37 MDQS, if I remove this solar charge controller here, which I'll throw up some pictures of how you do this step by step, but if I take off the solar charge controller, that'll give me access to the wires behind this control panel area, right? And what you'll find is a bunch of wires. They're not labeled, but they are color coded. And you're looking for a purple wire, a solid purple wire. And that solid purple wire should be terminated here. It should come to an end with one of those Wago wire nuts on the end of it, and that's the purple wire that runs all the way back to the rear camera. Now that purple wire, it's not connected to anything initially, it's just a spare wire. So then you've got to go to the rear of the RV and physically remove the rear camera and the rear housing to gain access to the hole where the camera wires exit the rear fiberglass wall. And to my delight, that same purple wire was just hanging out right there by the hole in the fiberglass. It even had a little bit of slack so that I could easily, pull it out. And so the goal here is to disconnect the Furrion camera from the running lights or the clearance lights, which in my case was a solid green wire, and then replace it with the unused purple wire. Which, by the way, if you've seen my other videos, you'll notice there are actually traditional crimp style connectors used here, which is the first time that I've seen Jayco use a traditional crimp style connector to join 2 wires. Everywhere else on the RV that I've taken things apart, I've only encountered those nicer Wago lever nuts. And I believe Jayco did this specifically here as the hole in the fiberglass. It's probably a little too snug to fit those Wago wire nuts. Anyway, that's just a side note. But back to the goal, we just want to connect the red wire coming from the Furrion camera to the unused purple wire. Now I went ahead and I soldered my wires together. I didn't want anything to come loose with all the bumps going down the road. But really, there's nothing wrong with using the traditional crimp connectors, so whatever you're comfortable with there. So that's the first step. Then we've got to go back to the other end of the purple wire, back by the control panel here, and do one of 2 things. If you just want your camera to be on 100% of the time, basically anytime your battery disconnect is disabled, anytime you've got 12-volt power to your coach, then you can literally just connect the purple wire to the 12-volt positive wire that Jayco already supplies in this same area. And in my case, it's a solid pink wire. Again, it was just unused. It was left here by Jayco with a Wago lever nut. And you can just connect that purple wire to the pink, and then the rear backup camera will be powered on instantly. But for most of us, I think it's kind of a nice touch to have a switch that lets you turn on and off the cameras. Especially if you keep your unit in storage in between trips. Maybe you're trickle charging your battery, or if you're like me, you keep it plugged into shore power. Then there's no need to have the cameras on all the time when it's in storage. And so that's why I chose to wire in this switch over here so that I can choose when to turn on and off the cameras. Now, I did choose an illuminated switch so that I know whether they are on or off, but even a basic switch like this one over here that happens to be for the ceiling fan, it's really your preference in the end. But you can see the wiring there, the picture, it's basically got a positive from the battery, the hot, and that's the pink wire that I already showed you. And then the purple wire, that's my load, that's the cameras. And then because I've got a light on the switch, an indicator light, then I also need to tie in a ground. And that's going to be this thinner black wire with the red stripe. Now you might be thinking, well, where did you get that ground wire from? Well, thankfully, with all these wires back here behind the control panel, there was an existing solid white ground wire already in this area. And so I was able to determine that by using a multimeter in the ohm mode to measure the resistance. And all I did is intercept it with another Wago lever nut, and then I ran this black and red wire to the switch, and that serves as my ground. All right, so you might be thinking, what about your side cameras? All this time you've been talking about the rear cameras, but did Jayco also wire in a spare wire to the side cameras? And unfortunately, the answer is no, meaning that you have to actually physically run a wire to each of the side cameras up front, and then go all the way here to this same location to tie it into the switch. And this is by far the more daunting part of this project, at least in my opinion, because it's a pretty good distance to be fishing wires in your RV. But the good news is, I will say that if you have a Pinnacle or a North Point and your floor plan is similar to mine, then chances are you can take the same path and route that I eventually settled on. So let me share what I learned in the process of doing this. All right, so here we are on the outside of the fifth wheel, and you can see I've got a side marker camera here on the front corner. And then if we go all the way around to the other side, we've got the same setup here. So the first step is to unmount both of them, as we're going to need access to the wires and the channel that runs behind them. And again, I'll throw up some pictures of this process so you can see step by step what it looks like. If you've got sealant around yours like mine, then you're going to need to carefully break that sealant up first. And then there's a total of 6 screws that you need to remove the lights in the camera. There's 4 that are actually holding on the marker light, and then there's 2 more that are securing the camera itself. And the camera it almost just slides off of the marker light. So once you get the marker lights removed, you'll notice there's another solid green wire attached to the red wire on the Furrion camera. So really same exact setup that we found on the rear camera. And basically we need to isolate that solid red wire on the Furrion camera and then supply a new power wire to it. So we're going to disconnect that red wire from the green in the Wago lever nut. And then comes the hardest part in my opinion, and that is figuring out how to run that new wire all the way from here to that new switch that I've added by the control panel inside. And I spent a couple of hours really exploring different paths before settling on one. Initially I saw the open channel behind the marker light and I thought, ooh, this is going to be easy. I'll just take fish tape, run it down the channel along this edge here behind the marker light, and then pick it up right by the radius behind the wall here, this curve, and then go through the basement storage to the rest of the path. But when I put the fish tape down this channel here, I kept running into a dead end, and it kind of sounded like metal. So eventually I pulled out my scope, my little video scope, and I fed it down the channel and discovered, sure enough, pretty much the end of the channel, it was being blocked by what looked like part of the frame. And I didn't want to drill into the frame, and so I explored another option. You'll notice on mine, the green wires for the running lights, they run actually toward the front cap, the opposite direction. And so I thought, well, maybe I could fish the wires that same route and somehow end up back in the basement in the storage area there. But when I explored that a little bit further, it really seemed like I'd have to open up a wall, probably behind my front closet in the bedroom, to get access to that. And so I kind of veered away from that option. Well, long story short, I decided to give it a rest. Then I came back the next day. I put the scope down that channel, and the scope has a little light on the end of it to kind of brighten up things on the video. And then I happened to take a peek on the opposite side inside the propane compartments on both sides, you know, kind of looking toward where it was getting blocked by the frame. And then I noticed I could actually see some light kind of bleeding through from the scope, meaning that the dead end where it was hitting on each side, it wasn't completely sealed. And so that kind of gave me a clear indication of where it was getting hung up. And then I also noticed that the bottom of this channel here, this open channel where the wires are running, it's actually kind of like a wood filler strip, almost like a wood backer. And I'm thinking maybe Jayco puts it there for screws that fasten all this trim on the outside, so they have something to bite into on the opposite side there. And then I noticed that Jayco puts a 3/4 inch piece of plywood along this radius edge right here, and that's probably to support it, I imagine. So I figured out that if I carefully drilled through that thicker wood backer and then into the filler strip, I would land and end up in that same channel to create a hole just big enough for the wires to pass through. So you'll see that in the picture that I throw up there. You can see the drill bit peeking out, and then in the following picture you can see where I took that fish tape, that metal fish tape, and sent it through that same hole that I just drilled. So that's what I ended up settling on, and I'll just warn that the hole that I drilled, it's very close to the outer fiberglass, you know, probably only about 3/8 of an inch away from the Luan backer on the opposite side of this fiberglass wall. And so you've got to be very careful drilling, since it's at an angle. You know, if you go over too far, you could end up drilling into the sidewall and coming out and making a really ugly boo-boo. And so really, you know, having a video scope, a little mini camera with a live video feed, I gotta say that's really what gave me the confidence and helped me do this, as I was able to almost like have eyes inside the channel and see exactly where the drill was coming up through. And I'll throw up some pictures from the scope of what it was like inside again, so you can see that. You'll see how the drill bit came up just right in the center of that channel in the bottom piece of that wood. And this is the same location that I'm showing you from the opposite side here in the propane bank on either side. So again, I'm just showing you what I did, how I created a clear path for that wire to run, but yours may be a little bit different. So, you know, just take your time. Be careful not to avoid drilling through something that you don't intend to. But kind of fast forward, once that was all said and done, it became a lot easier to then just send that fish tape through the new hole down the channel and then out by the side cameras. And so then I just had to run a wire, which I actually used that same 16 gauge wire that I've shown in my previous other videos. You know, I like that it's got an outer jacket for some extra protection, and it actually has 2 wires inside, a red and a black. And so I figure, even though I only need one here, I might as well have a spare in case something in the future, you know, ever calls for it. But basically, I just fished that wire to each of the cameras, and then I joined them together over by the hydraulic pump in the front storage bay. You'll see lots of other wires here, but you can see the larger white ones with that white jacket on the outside, and those are the new wires that I ran. And you can see I just joined them together, the red ones with the Wago lever nut, and I did the same with the black even though they're not in use. And then I labeled everything just for clarity in case someone else comes behind me and wants to know what those wires are. And then running the wires to the control panel at this point, it's pretty straightforward. You can see here in the basement storage that same white wire, and it's just running along this existing bundle of wires. So that's the path that I chose. And then I went all the way back above the tanks, they're just below us here, and all the way alongside the stairs inside. Now let me take you inside, as it got a little bit tricky from the stairs going up to the control panel. So here we are on the inside, and if you remove this grate on the stair riser here, there's a small access hole right behind it with some existing wires that go up vertically into the wall here. And I'll throw up some pictures again, but basically that existing hole is where I entered the wall with my new wire. And you'll see there in the picture there's a flat gray wire going into this same hole. And that actually is the existing cable for the inverter remote panel up here. And so then this wall, it's an interior wall in the RV. It's framed kind of like one in your house, you know, with vertical studs that are spaced every so often. And so we've actually got to jump across one of those studs here. And so I use this inverter remote here, and then this switch, this is a ceiling fan switch on the opposite side, kind of like access points on either side of the stud. And then I just drilled a small hole through that stud to pass the wire through. And you can see in the picture on the opposite side of the stud, here's that 12-volt ceiling fan switch. And I noticed on that ceiling fan switch, the same colored wire that's here was already up behind the control panel over here. And so I knew that it was a clear path going from this ceiling fan switch all the way up to control panel. You know, so it's just kind of a process of taking one step at a time and just kind of jumping from one point to the next until you can get to the final destination. All right, so that's in a nutshell how I ran the wires between the control panel here and the side marker cameras. Now let's finish up and talk about the final connections. So back out at the side marker cameras, I used the red wire on my new run, on the new wire that I ran, as the power for the side cameras. So I just took a new Wago lever nut and combined the red wire to the red wire on the Furrion camera. And as I said before, the Furrion camera, that red wire was attached to the green wires before. But again, those are the running lights, and so we want those green wires to remain as is because they are supplying power to all the rest of the lights. They're kind of just all, you know, daisy chained and connected together. So we don't want to mess those up. And you can see there in the picture what everything looks like with the final connections made. The black wire, that surplus black wire that was in my new bundle that I ran, I just terminated it with shrink wrap so that there's not an open conductor potentially in the future. Then before you mount the running lights and everything back into the sidewall, here's just a quick tip. Double check that the cameras and then your lights, that they're all functioning as expected. So I mean, I actually backed up my truck and plugged in the 7-way connector just to make sure that everything was good before I reattached everything. Now before you permanently reattach the markers, obviously you're going to want to clean off the old sealant. And you can just use a gentle solvent like mineral spirits. And then really it's just a matter of reattaching the lights and applying new sealant around the perimeter of the lights and the cameras. Now I actually ended up sealing the entire seam here all the way down the radius of both sides, as I wasn't thrilled with how it looked beforehand. But either way, you definitely want to make sure to remove any of the old sealant before applying the new. If you don't, it's just not going to hold up. And there's plenty of other videos that detail how to do that process with sealant. But for those curious, I use the GeoCell ProFlex sealant, and I think it came out looking pretty clean in the end. And then of course you'll want to do the same thing with the rear backup camera. Alright, so that's pretty much from start to finish how to do this mod with the wiring and all. And I realized that's a lot of details I went through, and I went through it pretty quickly. But one of the reasons that I put this mod off for so long is that I really hoped to find more information from someone who had already done it, you know, to kind of give me a head start. And I really couldn't find anything, so I just kept putting it off. And so hopefully sharing all these details with you will give you the confidence you need to get this done on your own RV. But let me go back to the earlier comment I made about solving the problem of being able to use your cameras on the rig in a multi-purpose fashion and then using them as surveillance, you know, kind of a security system of sorts while you're at your campsite. So my rig came from the factory with the 3 cameras outside and then this monitor here, but Furrion also provided this nice desktop stand that holds the display. And so this is perfect to use inside the RV. You know, I'll probably keep it here in the master bedroom most of the time, which there is a 12-volt outlet in my Pinnacle right here on the side of the dresser. But if you don't have a 12-volt outlet handy nearby, you can also buy a compatible 120-volt AC adapter that is matched to the power requirements here on the Furrion display. And I'll include a link to this one here in the description below. But check out how nice this is. I mean, now you've got a security system in your RV where you can monitor all around the rig at the campsite. You can select which camera that you want to view, you know, one at a time individually, or you can have all of them on the same screen at the same time. And you'll notice there's one that's blacked out here. There's an option for a fourth camera, and that'd be a camera over your entry door, which I don't have, but that'd be another nice angle to have, so maybe I'll look into that in the future. I think I've seen it factory installed on a few other brands, I think maybe Cedar Creek, but it's basically just another rear view style camera that goes over your entry door. But anyway, I'm really pleased with the end result here. It's really nice to be able to use the cameras for security, and then I especially like being able to turn the cameras on and off as I want, right, without having to keep my running lights on 100% of the time. Well, that's all the details I've got to share on this mod, but definitely let me know what you think in the comments below. Is this something that you're going to attempt to complete on your rig? And if I left any details out or you've got any questions, feel free to drop me a comment below. I will include affiliate links to the different products I used featured in this video in the description below, so I appreciate you using those to support the channel. As always, thanks for watching.